Heavy fighting escalates between Israel and Hamas with no end in sight. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. It began with weeks of daily clashes between Palestinian protesters and Israeli police in Jerusalem. On Thursday, rockets continued to stream out of Gaza, and Israel pounded the territory with airstrikes as both sides engaged in heavy fighting. The latest battle is reminiscent of their 2014 conflict. That one lasted 50 days. Fast forward to this week with neither the Israelis nor the Palestinians showing any signs of backing down. CGTN's Stephanie Freid has more in this report.
The Gaza-Israel conflict continued on Thursday with no sign of de-escalation as both sides fired rockets and missiles throughout the day in an exchange described by military experts as unprecedented in its scope and intensity. As Hamas threatened Israel with an arsenal of short and medium-range rockets capable of hitting, quote, any city in Israel, Israel is calling up 7,000 reserve soldiers and deploying armory and infantry brigades to the Gaza border. Speculation around an imminent Israel ground invasion into Gaza is growing as international appeals for a ceasefire are met with defiance from both sides. As Israel's interim Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said, "We'll hit them like they never dreamed possible," Hamas militants warned international airlines against flying to Israel, saying the group is targeting Israel's airports. Israel halted all flights going in and out of the country's international airport Thursday, rerouting air traffic to southern Israel. On Thursday, Hamas announced the southern Israel hub was targeted by rocket attacks. Israel is also on the brink of civil war as rampaging gangs of Jews and Arabs battle each other on the streets of dozens of cities throughout the country, carrying out lynches and torching businesses, cars, and homes in what is being described as anarchy. Stephanie Freid, CGTN, on the Gaza-Israel border.
Joining us now from Ramallah is Hanan Ashrawi, long an advocate for Palestinian rights. She's been an educator, legislator, and spokeswoman for the Palestinian delegation to the Israeli-Palestinian peace talks back in the early 1990s. Most recently, she served as a member of the PLO Executive Committee. Hanan, thanks so much for joining us.
My pleasure, Anand. It's good to see you again.
Great to see you as well at this time. Let's look at the situation right now. Dozens of Palestinians have been killed, including at least 16 children. And on the Israeli side, 6 Israelis have been killed, including, we understand, a soldier as well. And latest reports say that the Israelis are massing at the Gaza border. There could be a land invasion taking place very soon. What is your assessment of what has happened and what is possibly going to happen?
Unfortunately, this is a very sinister and lethal pattern that we have seen repeatedly. Israel seems to think that it can tame and subdue a whole nation under occupation through the use of sheer power and weapons and brute force. Unfortunately, it keeps repeating itself, knowing that nothing will happen unless the occupation ends and unless Israel stops its massive escalation against the Palestinians. It's a very drastic situation. Yes, we do have 87 Palestinians in Gaza killed. There are some killed in the West Bank. And we do have, among them, there are 18 women and 8 children. 35 people seriously injured in Gaza. The situation is tragic. Israel knows no constraints, whether moral or legal or human. And it is pursuing this policy, thinking that they can have an occupation with calm and peace and quiet. This isn't going to happen.
Hanan, let's look at what the Palestinians can or cannot do. I mean, we do know that this is a very unequal war with the Palestinians vastly outgunned. They're facing an ultra-modern military with sophisticated weapons, intelligence capabilities, satellite capabilities, and other state resources. Given that reality, isn't it a provocation for the Palestinians to start firing rockets into Israeli territory?
Well, the real provocation started with Israel targeting Jerusalem. First of all, the neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah, trying to ethnically cleanse East Jerusalem, starting with this neighborhood with Sheikh Jarrah, and attempting to kick the Palestinian families there out of their homes. And then they targeted the holy sites in the holiest month of Ramadan. They went into the compound, they went into Haram Sharif, Al-Aqsa Mosque, they fired tear gas and stun grenades, they beat up worshippers, they prevented people from going to their normal places of worship and congregation in East Jerusalem. It was a big show of strength and provocation, and they certainly provoked all Palestinians, be they Christian or Muslim. The sense that Israel now is showing that it calls the shots, it can do whatever it wants in Jerusalem and in Palestine as a whole and get away with it. And they were warned repeatedly, and Hamas asked them to stop and gave them ultimatum and deadlines, and they refused, they persisted. And this led to this explosion in Gaza, where there were a few projectiles, you call them rockets, whatever you want, cast at Israel. Now, the thing is, Israel is not used to paying the price for anything it does, because it's been granted preferential treatment and it acts with full impunity. And this is one of the times in which there was a price for its actions from Gaza. And obviously, it had a plan in place of a very brutal and reckless military assault that totally destroyed residential buildings, high-rises, infrastructure, in addition to the lives of human beings and the future of children. This is not acceptable at all, and we believe Israel has to be held accountable and has to abide by international law and international humanitarian law.
There has also been another very dangerous and insidious development which we've been seeing on the streets of Jerusalem, and that's where we're seeing fighting between Palestinians and Jews on the streets. This is sectarian fighting that's taking place on the streets. What do you know about that? How concerned are you about that? And could that escalate?
Yeah, well, in Jerusalem is a Palestinian city after all. It's occupied by Israel, but it's not an Israeli city. So it has been oppressed and targeted, its land stolen, and the homes demolished, and so on for some time now. But within Israel proper, if you will, the indigenous people, the Palestinians who stayed when the State of Israel was created in 1947-48, these are the ones who are now being targeted and who are clashing with the extremist Jewish elements in Israel. As you know, for a long time now, Israel has practiced systemic and legalized discrimination against them, whether in education or in housing or in schooling, in hospitals, in healthcare, in every possible way. And at the same time, Netanyahu and his right-wing government have been moving to the right, have been moving to the most extreme, violent, racist ideology, and they have encouraged these racist elements within Israel and, of course, in the West Bank. So this policy that has been endemic, that has been built into the system, particularly with the racist laws that were adopted, the nation-state law that says in Israel, only the Jews can have self-determination, which is licensed to discriminate, licensed to exercise Jewish supremacy, and to exercise violence, of course, against the Palestinians. So matters have come to a head. You have a provocation in Jerusalem, the capital of Palestine, and the most holy places in Jerusalem, and provocations in Gaza and the killing of the innocents. And of course, there are protests in the West Bank and now in Israel proper, where you have the indigenous Palestinians facing horrendous violence by extremist Jewish groups. So it just exposed, it lays wide open the real nature of the Israeli system and the nature of the violence inherent within the Israeli society as a whole.
Well, as you say, matters have come to a head, and it doesn't seem that either side is prepared to back down right now and allow more at least calmer minds to prevail. The Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu insists that Jerusalem is Israel's undivided capital, despite the fact that, as you pointed out, East Jerusalem is occupied territory. This is what Prime Minister Netanyahu had to say. Let's listen.
We will not allow extremist elements to disturb the peace in Jerusalem. We will enforce law and order decisively and responsibly. We will continue to ensure freedom of worship to all religions, but will not allow violent unrest. Jerusalem is Israel's capital, and just as every nation builds in its capital and builds up its capital, we also have the right to build in Jerusalem and to build up Jerusalem. That is what we have done, and that is what we will continue to do.
So there you hear it, Hanan, the Prime Minister saying we have a right to build in Jerusalem. I mean, where does it go to from here?
But this is entirely antithetical to international law and to the will of the international community. Everybody in the world voted that Jerusalem is a Palestinian city which is occupied by Israel and therefore subject to the Fourth Geneva Convention. Only Netanyahu seems to think in his dream world that Jerusalem is his. They've annexed it illegally. They've been carrying out systematic oppression and land confiscation and house demolitions and evictions in Jerusalem, trying to change the character and the history of Jerusalem. Now, I could say I like London, I want London to be my capital, and I want to build in my capital. But London is not my capital, the same thing that East Jerusalem is not Israel's capital. It's our city, it's a Palestinian city, and no matter how much they try, ethnic cleansing or genetic engineering or demographic engineering, they're not going to transform the character of the city, its history, its culture, and turn it into an exclusively Jewish city. This is unacceptable. And that's why it provokes Palestinians, Christians, and Muslims everywhere, and people who respect international law and believe that Palestinians have equal rights.
Hanan, I've just got about a minute left, but I want to look at the international response to what is happening in the region right now. China has called for a de-escalation. It strongly condemned the violence against civilians. In fact, China has called for all relevant parties, quoting here, especially Israel, to exercise restraint. But there hasn't been much from the rest of the world. In fact, Israel's main international supporter, the United States, appears reluctant to get involved. There is an envoy going to the region from the United States. It's a pretty low-tier civil servant to talk to the Israelis, and he will not be talking to Hamas. He'll be talking to the Palestinian Authority, which really has no control over the fighting that is taking place right now. What do you make of the international response, and what would you like to see from the international community?
Well, on the whole, it's rather feeble, but this has been the case with the international community for a long time. We get lip service, we get denunciations of Israeli violations and violence, we get sometimes statements of support, but we never see that translated into action. Even UN resolutions have never been respected, abided by, or implemented. China, yes, did condemn, several countries condemned. But what is needed is serious intervention to curb Israeli violations, to provide the Palestinians with protection, to provide accountability for Israel, and to deal with the real causes rather than constantly dealing with the outcome or with the symptoms. So, and Biden, as you said, is sending a low-level civil servant, which doesn't say much. He suffers from the illusion that he can sort of ignore this very volatile situation based on injustice and cruelty, and that it will go away. If you ignore it, it's not going to go away. It can only get worse, because unless you end the occupation, unless you treat the Palestinians as equal, unless you hold Israel accountable in accordance with international law, this is a situation that is going to continue, is going to be aggravated, and is going to escalate. It might quiet down for a while, but it will flare up again. So either deal with the causes and have a serious, responsible handling of the issues, treat Israel within the confines of the law, or you're going to end up with periodic, if not more lethal, violence and confrontations and Israeli aggression and assaults, because they seem to suffer again from the mistaken notion that they can subdue a whole nation forever, right, and they can have peace and quiet.
Hanan Ashrawi, thanks for joining us.
You're welcome. It's my pleasure.
Now, to continue our coverage, let's get to our panel. Jeremy Saltan is a political analyst and member of Yamina, an alliance of right-wing political parties in Israel. Ali Abunimah is an author and co-founder of the digital site, the Electronic Intifada. And Amotz Asa-El is an award-winning journalist and senior commentator for the Jerusalem Post. Thank you, everyone, for being with us. Amotz Asa-El, let me start with you. Talking there to Hanan Ashrawi, you heard what she said. She said that Israel has to be held accountable, that Israel is in violation of international law, that the dispossession of land and homes for the Palestinians is a violation of international law, and that Palestinians would not be subjugated by the Israeli military. What do you say to that?
Well, I say that this is a typical, a good example of her tactic of changing the subject. The subject right now, in other words, the trigger of this violence, which she conveniently ignored, is the fact that her operation, namely the Palestinian Authority, canceled the general election that was supposed to take place in the West Bank imminently, and they canceled it because they feared with good reason that they were going to lose it to Hamas. Hamas saw that the election was stolen and responded the way it did because this is its way to tell the Palestinian Authority that the Israelis with whom they, Hanan Ashrawi and her friends, rightly and bravely, I must say, do dialogue with, Hamas is totally opposed to any dialogue with and to any recognition of. This is one thing.
Yeah.
Secondly, she also ignored the fact that Hamas, unlike the way she portrays its struggle, Hamas's struggle is not nationalistic, it's religious fundamentalist. And the reason she ignores this is that she herself is Christian and is also part of what they target, and she would never in her life hold any kind of office as she does had Hamas been in control. This is indeed why she and her colleagues so much fear Hamas's takeover of the West Bank.
Ali Abunimah, do the Palestinians rather have to accept some of the blame for this because elections were postponed? They did not have a way to express their political will, as Amotz Asa-El just told us.
This has nothing to do with the elections. What we're seeing right now across historic Palestine, from Gaza, across the West Bank and within the areas occupied in 1948, is a massive uprising of all Palestinians against a settler colonial regime. And it's quite ironic for your other guest to talk about religious fundamentalism when the trigger for this current escalation was Israel's effort, its constant effort to impose its will in Jerusalem, to Judaize Jerusalem, to ethnically cleanse families from occupied East Jerusalem. And I think Israel made a major miscalculation when they thought they had a free hand in Jerusalem to continue this ethnic cleansing, thinking there would be no response from Palestinian resistance groups in Gaza. And I think Israel got a severe lesson that Palestinians are quite unified around the legitimacy of resistance. Like any occupied people and like any people living under a colonial regime like Israel's. And I just want to say, in terms of the violence now, there is absolutely no moral equivalence whatsoever between a nuclear-armed military occupier attacking civilians caged in a ghetto like Gaza and an occupied people defending themselves, exercising their right to self-defense and resistance with the limited means they have. One is legitimate, the other, being Israel's actions, is a war crime. And I would like to see, as someone who believes in law and order, Israeli leaders like Netanyahu and Benny Gantz dragged before the International Criminal Court, as I'm sure we will see them one day.
Jeremy Saltan, is that at the root of the problem? This is an attempt by Israel to, as Ali Abunimah put it, Judaize Jerusalem, to dispossess Palestinians of their land, of their homes, move them out forcibly in the city?
No, not at all. That does not have anything to do with what's going on. Let's remember what happened in terms of the timeline. The stuff that happened in Jerusalem was before what we're seeing happening in terms of the rockets and what's coming out from Gaza. Hamas, who has no control whatsoever over Jerusalem, is dealing with the fact that they do not feel a part of what's going on. They set, people forget this perhaps, but a few days ago, a list of ultimatums on Jerusalem and other issues, and they said if Israel did not respond, they would start to unilaterally fire rockets across all of Israel, including firing at Jerusalem, the very city that they claim that they love so much. So what we see here is Hamas trying to insert themselves very strategically into an ongoing situation to try to be able to have the conversation move over to them.
Okay,
that's what's going on.
Jeremy, there's another point here. You know, as I said to Hanan Ashrawi, this is not an equal fight. Israel has the ability, we know, to inflict immense pain on the Palestinians. They are doing so right now. But there is another battle being fought here, isn't there? That's a battle for the hearts and minds of people around the world. And when we see pictures of civilian buildings, civilian apartment blocks being bombed to the ground, what kind of message do you think that sends to the international community?
Well, I think what the message that we should be sending is, and I think it's unfortunate that this message does not go out, is the fact that what Hamas is doing is putting the rocket launchers on the top of residential apartment buildings. They put it within hospital and educational complexes. I don't think that that is something that makes the pictures that you are talking about on the various newspapers throughout the globe. I think instead, as you said, they have instead the pictures of the poor women, children, babies that have died as a result of this conflict. But I will tell you something. The ones who are responsible are not the Israeli Air Force that goes ahead and presses the button on those bombs. The one who is responsible for those deaths are Hamas, who are choosing deliberately to put those innocent civilians in a place to have a situation of collateral damage. And that is despicable in my view.
Okay, Ali Abunimah, the Hamas leader, Ismail Haniyeh, he says the group is ready, but, you know, if we look at Gaza right now, it's slowly being flattened by Israeli bombs. I mean, let's listen to what the Israeli Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, had to say.
These sons of darkness, the terrorists of Hamas and Islamic Jihad, they bear the responsibility. We eliminated senior commanders in the Hamas General Command, including the commander of Gaza Brigade and other commanders. This is just the beginning. We will strike them with hits they did not dream of.
So, Ali, I mean, those are ominous words there from Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. And isn't this a little bit suicidal on the part of Palestinians to take on the Israelis in this way, firing rockets into Israel?
Let me say two things. First, I think it's important to respond to the lies that were told by your other guest. Now, if Hamas were really putting rocket launchers on the top of residential buildings, I'm sure Israel, with all its drones and all its surveillance technology, would be able to provide evidence of that. But instead, what happened yesterday, in fact on Tuesday, is Ophir Gendelman, the senior spokesman of Prime Minister Netanyahu, put out a video which he claimed showed Hamas firing rockets from next to an apartment building. He put that on Twitter. What did Twitter do? They put a label on it, the kinds of labels they used to put on the tweets of Donald Trump, saying that it was manipulated media and it was in fact a video from Syria taken in 2018 from the city of Daraa in Syria that had nothing to do with Gaza. So we've heard all these lies repeatedly, which are designed to blame the victims and absolve Israel from liability for war crimes. And if it were true that Hamas were placing civilians in harm's way, Israel would still be responsible legally for knowingly attacking sites where many civilians were present. So this is a lie that we hear repeated constantly.
All right.
As far as whether it's suicidal, you asked me a question, I'd like to answer it. The Palestinians, you know, they're damned if they do and they're damned if they don't. In the West Bank, you have a Palestinian Authority that for decades has been collaborating with the Israeli occupation, doing so-called security coordination, which Israeli security officials praise them for routinely. Has that protected Palestinians from the demolition of their homes, from the theft of their land, from racist, fanatical settlers taking their homes? It hasn't. So Palestinians have the right to resist. They have the right to struggle. And I'll say this in closing. Apartheid South Africa had nuclear weapons, had warplanes, had world powers on its side, and it did not survive against the resistance of an indigenous people. And Israel's apartheid regime is heading in the same direction.
Amotz, if we look at the international response to this, as I said earlier on, China has called for de-escalation. Now we have the Turkish president, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, who's reportedly told the Russian President Vladimir Putin that Israel should be given, quote, a strong and deterrent lesson. I mean, there's no clarity on what that lesson should be, but does it concern you what the international response has been, especially the fact that the U.S. is now seems to be adopting a hands-off approach?
My question to Mr. Erdogan, if he's an interlocutor here in any way, would first of all be, how come he is occupying northern Cyprus by any legal yardstick and still has what to tell others? So let's get him out of the discussion. What he says is completely inconsistent with his own actions, and it is typical hypocrisy. Set him aside. My question is to Mr. Abunimah. Yeah. He says that we, the Israelis, are laying siege to Gaza and caging its population. So my question is cartographic. I looked in the atlas, and I saw that the Gaza Strip is a rectangle whose northern side is the sea, whose eastern and southern side are indeed Israel, and are indeed not open for civilian traffic, although there is plenty of commercial traffic in full and broad daylight daily. But then there is the western side. The western flank of Gaza borders on Egypt. So my question to Mr. Abunimah is, are they also laying siege to Gaza? And if not, then how come he says that Gaza is under siege?
All right, let me give Ali a chance.
I'd be happy to answer that. I'd be happy to answer that. Of course, Egypt, the Sisi dictatorship, which, like Israel, is a client of the United States and an ally of Israel, is helping Israel's siege of Gaza. Just like Israel is besieging Gaza from the sea and the land on three sides, the Sisi dictatorship, which oppresses the Egyptian people, also oppresses the Palestinian people and does it in full alliance with Israel. So I express my solidarity to the Egyptian people as well, who live under the Israeli-allied Sisi dictatorship. Okay. So absolutely, the answer to the question is yes.
Thanks for the clarification, and I suggest only one comment.
Okay, I want to get to Jeremy Saltan. Jeremy,
I suggest that in the future, when you say Israel lays siege and cages the Palestinian population of Gaza, please rephrase it and say Israel and Egypt jointly cage Palestinians in Gaza. Yeah, you'd be more accurate according to your own explanations. Good, I'm happy we've clarified that. Thanks.
Okay. Happy to clarify that. But
that's
none
the beginning
of that
of an interesting dialogue between the two of us, I should hope.
None of that lessens, none of that reduces the Israeli liability as the occupying power. Despite Egyptian complicity, Israel is, under international law, the occupying power and is in violation of the Fourth Geneva Convention and is liable.
Israel is evacuated Gaza.
There isn't one Israeli
person, whether civilian or military, in Gaza.
I have to move on to Jeremy. Thanks. I have to move on to Jeremy. Jeremy, you know, we were talking earlier on about the fact that Israeli troops have now massed at the Gaza border, possibility of a land invasion into Gaza. What kind of risks are there in that kind of strategy?
Well, look, we're in a situation which, obviously, without seeing any restraint here from Hamas, we could end up seeing a very, very, very long land-ground operation, similar to what we saw in 2014 of Operation Protective Edge.
Right.
I really hope that that isn't the case, but it is very, very possible that that is the direction in which we are going.
And that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.